I decided to take on the project of building a new desk for my home studio slash office space out of this beautiful live edge maple slab here behind me. And the reason I chose to go with maple rather than a darker wood like walnut is mainly because I wanted a brighter workspace. Now, I do appreciate the coziness of darker woods in the right situations, but I also just love maple as a wood to work with. I think it is super beautiful, and this slab just spoke to me and felt like the perfect piece for this project. So, with that said, I hope you enjoy the build, and let's get started. This slab currently weighs about 320 pounds, so with the help of my dad, who let me clear out a small section of his garage, we moved it onto some blocks of wood on the ground so I could cut it down and take a good chunk of weight off and bring it closer to the final dimensions to make it much easier to work with going forward. The slab is currently just over 10 feet long, but my desk is going to be 6 feet, so I decided to cut it down to about 6 foot 4 inches for the first rough cut to give a little room on each end so that I could come back and square it up perfectly to make the final cuts later. I'll start by using my circular saw with a guide, but the slab is about 2 3/4 inches thick and my saw only has a maximum depth of just over 2.5 inches, so I have to do a second pass with the Japanese saw by hand to finish the cut. And for those of you wondering, I may as well tell you how I came across this slab in the first place. I got it from a wood place in Pennsylvania for around $1,500, which was an amazing deal for a slab like this. The only concern I had was that I live in a very different climate, and the slab had to survive the hot shipping truck on the way over, as well as adapt to my climate, hopefully without warping or cracking. But I wasn't too worried because my wood supplier does an amazing job of making sure the slab is properly dried to prevent problems like that in the future. I still wanted to be sure though, so after it arrived, I let it sit in the garage to acclimate for about 2 months, taking careful measurements each week to make sure it didn't warp or change before I started work on it. And thankfully it didn't, so I was good to go. Now that the slab was cut to a more manageable size, I could put it on the router sled that I built in my last video, and I'll leave a link to that video in the description if you're interested. But the purpose of the router sled is to make the slab perfectly flat. It's basically like a big planer that eliminates all the warping and curves and makes the slab all the same thickness, because as you can see, my slab has a bit of a curve in it, and I definitely want my desk to be flat. So I first put some shims under each opposite corner of the slab to eliminate any rocking and split the difference so that I could take off as little material as possible when flattening it. And these were just hot glued into place to hold temporarily, but the weight of the slab was plenty to keep it in place, so I didn't have to screw it down or anything. Now it was time for the router, and I started by doing a first pass on the end of the slab going against the grain, and this would be a reference point to make sure that each pass I did would be the same depth as that first pass, so that I could see if the router bit was backing out or accidentally making things uneven. And once the first pass was complete, I could continue doing the rest of the passes, this time going along the grain, and each time I returned back to the first pass to make sure it was the proper depth and all was well before moving on to the next. And you might be wondering why I'm going along the grain rather than against it, because if you've watched other videos like this, you've probably seen many people who go against it. And that can work if you have a very small router sled, but if it's big enough to do the whole slab in one go like mine, then it's much better to go along the grain as it makes a much smoother cut with less tear out, which will make your router bit last longer and save you lots of sanding time afterward. And speaking of the router bit, I'm using a 2-inch bit from Amazon that I bought for about $14, and it cuts perfectly fine. So there's really no need to buy a super expensive bit, especially if you're just using it for a few projects. And I will leave links to some of the tools and parts I'm using for this project in the description, so feel free to check them out and also comment below if you have any other questions or thoughts. And the router I'm using is an old 1 3/4 horsepower Porter cable router, which is definitely a bit underpowered for the 2-inch bit I'm using, but it still works fine, and old tools just seem to last forever no matter what you throw at them. So I'd say it was being pretty successful so far, but if I did this kind of thing a lot, then I would probably invest in a router that was closer to 3 horsepower. Once all the passes at the first depth were finished, I lowered the router by about an 1/8 inch and repeated the same process, doing 1/8 inch passes across the entire face of the slab until it was all flat. And then I flipped it over to do the same exact thing to the other side of the slab. Using the router sled to flatten the slab was honestly the most satisfying part of this project. It was definitely hard on my back though to work on the garage floor, and I do hope to have a shop of my own someday, where I can have large workbenches and tables to lay things out on and a better working environment. But I was still very lucky to have an enclosed space to keep the slab out of the sun and elements, which was the most important part. It definitely would not be comfortable though to do this all the time, but for this one project it all worked out just fine, and after a couple of hours of going back and forth with the router, it was finally finished. This turned out really, really well. I am so happy with it. I don't feel any ridges or anything, which means the router sled did a great job of keeping everything straight and flat. There's also no burn marks or any tear out from the router bit, so you can in fact go with a $14 Amazon router bit, especially if you're only doing 1 or 2 projects. And this is also maple, which is a hardwood, and this router bit just buttered right through it, so I am so happy with the results. The starting thickness of the slab was around 2 5/8 inches, and the ending thickness now after everything's flat is around 2 1/4 inches. So we only ended up taking off around 3/8 inches in total, which is really great. It didn't have too much of a twist or bend to begin with. It just had some tacoing. So yeah, super happy with the results. I'm also shocked that there are no holes or cracks or anything, so we might be able to get away without using any epoxy to fill in on this project, which just really surprises me. So with that said, I'm super happy with it, and the next step is to cut it to the final dimensions. Deciding where to make the final cuts was one of the most difficult parts of this project. It seemed so simple and easy, but I was in the garage for a few hours taking measurements and checking it over so many times to be absolutely sure where I wanted to make the cuts, because once it was cut to size, there would be no going back. My plan was to choose a live edge that I liked the most to leave and showcase for the front of the desk, and the other live edge would get cut off to create a straight edge for the back of the desk. And as much as I wanted to keep both the live edges, I knew in the end I needed that back edge to be straight to sit against a wall nicely and allow me to attach all of my desk accessories like a monitor arm to it without a live edge getting in the way. The line for the cut was marked by taking a few measurements from the live edge on the front and then drawing a line along the back to make the average width of the desk about 30 inches, while cutting off as little material as possible along the back. And to make the cut, I used a long aluminum extrusion from my router sled as a guide for my saw to make sure it would be perfectly straight. Once the back edge was cut, I could then square off of it to mark the cuts for the side edges, making the desk a final length of 6 feet, which is the perfect size for me to have all of my accessories within reach, but still have plenty of space for everything, and it would also fit easily in the bed of my truck to transport. When cutting the ends of the desk, I set my saw up to do a very shallow first pass to eliminate any tearing or splintering of the wood, since these cuts were going against the grain, and once the first pass was done, I could then lower my saw the rest of the way to finish the cut. I know I said earlier that I might not have to use epoxy for this project, and I probably didn't need to, but I decided to use it anyway to fill in some of the tiny cracks and small knot holes just to be sure they wouldn't become worse over time, and to make it feel perfectly smooth when it was finished. And for this, I just used some leftover System 3 epoxy, but if your cracks are super small like mine, then any epoxy will work fine as long as it's thin enough to soak down into the cracks, but if you have larger cracks or gaps, I would recommend using a deep pour epoxy and dyeing it black to look nice. Once the epoxy had hardened on both sides of the slab, I could start the sanding process, and I started by cleaning up the live edge with some 80 grit sandpaper on my orbital sander and lightly going over it, mainly focusing on smoothing out some small spots that had splintering or defects that I wanted to get rid of. The key here though is to just focus on those areas and use a very light pressure so that I don't take off too much material and can maintain the natural live edge look. And you may notice as well that my live edge doesn't have any bark on it, and that's because I pulled it off when the slab arrived, since it was very dry and easy to remove. And I know some people wonder if it's okay to leave the bark on, but if you do that, then it can continue rotting into the wood and will most likely end up falling off or looking messy eventually. So it's usually a good idea to remove it, either by peeling it off or breaking it loose with a chisel if you have to. And the same goes for any other rotten parts of the wood. Whether that's large knot holes or cracks, you'll want to remove any loose material, and you can always fill it in later with epoxy if you'd like. Now that the live edge was mostly cleaned up with the power sander, I could finish sanding it by hand, and unlike the power sander which has a flat surface, my hand is able to adjust to the shape of the edge much better to be able to sand out the sections and curves that the power sander wasn't able to get. The next step was to sand the surfaces of the slab to get rid of any roughness from the router sled and make it all feel nice and smooth. So I started by scribbling all over the slab with a pencil, and the purpose of doing this was to keep track of which areas had been sanded and which areas I might have missed. And you might be wondering, why not just sand the slab until it feels smooth rather than doing it based off of pencil markings? And while that works for the most part, it can also cause me to spend too much time sanding one area and not enough on others, which can create low spots in the surface of the slab, making it feel wavy if you run your hands over it. So by doing this extra step, it ensures that the surface of the slab will be perfectly flat, because I can sand each area evenly until the pencil markings just barely disappear. And once I was done with the first pass, I repeated the same steps for the following passes, each time using a finer grit of sandpaper, starting with 80 grit, then moving to 120, and then 150, then 180, and finally finishing off with 220. And the key here is to spend a lot of time on the sanding, and do it in good lighting as well to really make sure all of the scratches are out, because every scratch and imperfection will be amplified by a lot when the finish goes on. But you don't want to sand it too smooth. For this project I went to 220 grit, but in some cases you can even end with 180 because the wood still has to be porous enough to properly absorb the finish. And the quality of the sandpaper matters too. I'm using 3M Cubitron sandpaper, which works a lot better than others I've used in the past. The grain cuts very nice and doesn't get clogged easily, which makes the sandpaper last longer and provides a much better result. Now that the power sanding was finished, I could do some hand sanding around the sides to make them smooth, as well as round over the edges and corners. And I sanded it all to be just over an 1/8 inch round over for all the edges, and spent some extra time rounding the 2 front corners that stuck out the furthest, so that myself or anyone else wouldn't get hurt bumping into them. Now I know I've been talking a lot throughout this project, sharing my full process and lots of details, but I hope it's been helpful so far and inspiring, especially if you haven't done this kind of thing before. So if you're still watching and enjoying this video, then consider leaving a like and subscribing. And with that, the sanding is about finished, so we can move on to the next step of deciding where I wanted to attach the frame, which is the New Heights Elegante XT standing desk frame. I laid the frame upside down on the underside of the slab and positioned it exactly where I wanted it so that I could mark the holes where the screws would go to attach it. Because for this project I'm going to install threaded inserts that the screws can thread into rather than just screwing them into the wood itself, so that it can be disassembled and put back together easily if I ever needed to, without the screws or wood stripping out. The threaded inserts I'm going to use are Rampa inserts that are 18 millimeters long with a 12 millimeter diameter, so I'm using the recommended 10.5 millimeter drill bit, and I marked the depth with a piece of tape at about 21 millimeters, so that the holes could be a few millimeters deeper than the inserts themselves, but definitely make sure that your slab is thick enough for the inserts you're using, because it would really suck to accidentally drill all the way through the slab. Once the holes were drilled, I could install the threaded inserts, and I started by putting a small dab of epoxy on the threads to act as a lubricant when threading them in, as well as to strengthen the wood surrounding the inserts, but they'll also work just fine without the epoxy. And the nice thing about the Rampa inserts is that they're not only great quality, but they also have a patented thread design with 3 external threads to make them much easier to install, and they go in nice and straight. And as you can see, I'm just threading them in so that the top is just below the surface of the wood. Another thing I should mention at this stage of the project is that if you've done other research about building slab tables, you might be wondering if I'm going to use C-channels, and the short answer for this project is no. Now, for those of you who don't know what C-channels are, they're basically steel supports that get attached to the underside of the slab to hopefully prevent it from warping over time, but there's a lot of debate on whether or not they really work, and they definitely aren't a guarantee that the slab will stay flat. I would consider using them though if I was doing a larger project like a dining room table, where the slab is much wider and possibly thinner than what I'm using for my desk. But having worked in lutherie building stringed instruments, I have a good understanding of different types of woods and how they react to humidity and temperature, which definitely played a role in some of the decisions for this project. And from what I know about this slab and the research I've done, I decided not to use C-channels. So this isn't to say you shouldn't use them, but I encourage you to do some research for your specific project. And just know that wood is a natural material, and in some rare cases, it will behave unexpectedly beyond our control. So taking on projects like this will always have some level of risk involved. Now that the threaded inserts were installed, the desk was ready for finish. So I wiped it down with some mineral spirits to clean off any of the dust and get it ready. The finish I'm going to use is Rubio Monocoat Pure, which is a hard wax oil, and it should do a pretty good job of protecting the wood while still making it feel natural. And it's also VOC free and non-toxic, which is really nice. And you'll notice I have 2 cans here. The larger one is the oil and the smaller one is the accelerator, which is optional, but it helps the finish dry and cure much faster. So I'm mixing them together in a 2-to-1 ratio and making sure to stir it well before applying. And the process for applying this finish is pretty simple. I'm starting with the underside of the desk and just drizzling the oil over the slab, and then spreading it around to let the wood soak up as much as it wants. And for this, you could just use a plastic spreader, or you could do what I'm doing and use an old gift card, which honestly works just as well, other than the fact that it's limited to the size, but I have a bunch of them lying around and it worked great. So as long as what you're using is not metal or anything that could scratch or ruin the wood, then it should work just fine. And for the sides, I just used a rag to apply the oil. Once the finish was applied, I could wipe off the excess with a microfiber cloth and then start buffing it, which has to be done within about 10 minutes of applying the finish, or else the wax gets too tacky and becomes very difficult to buff. And this is basically how the finish works. The oil part of it soaks down into the wood, and then the wax gets buffed into the surface, which adds an extra layer of protection compared to using just an oil finish. This definitely would have been easier though with an electric buffer, but with a bit of elbow grease it worked out okay. And you want to do a good job on this step until the wood feels dry and smooth to the touch, because if you leave too much on, which is definitely easy to do, then it will feel waxy and grippy, which I definitely don't want. I could then flip the slab over and repeat the same process on the top surface. And for those of you wondering, the finished weight of the slab is around 130 pounds, so it's a lot lighter and much more manageable than it was to start with. And the desk frame I'm using is rated to lift 325 pounds, so I should be good even after I put my monitor and speakers and everything else on the desk. I ended up doing only one coat of finish, and in most cases that's all you'll need with Rubio Monocoat. Sometimes a second coat is preferred though for darker or more porous woods, but I'm very happy with how it turned out and how the finish really brings out the character in the wood. So with that, the slab part of the desk is pretty much done. Alright, so now that the slab is finished, it's time to mount the standing desk frame here. But one more thing I have to do to this frame before mounting it that I wanted to include in this video is that I have to elongate or expand these mounting holes here. And the reason for that is to account for wood movement, for the expansion and contraction of the wooden slab. I do live in a place with all 4 seasons, so I have temperature changes throughout the year, or maybe you have humidity changes, all that sort of thing. And we have to account for that movement because as you can see here, if I take my M6 screws that I'm going to be mounting the base with here and feed them through the hole, I have 0 movement. It just barely fits here, but does not have any play. And the reason that I need to expand these is that if the slab tries to move and the steel base is holding it or keeping it from moving, then it has the potential to crack. And I don't want that. And based on my calculations, this is only 16 inches wide here, and over the span of 16 inches, the slab should only move about 0.7 millimeters throughout the year, if that, based on my specific climate. And if I don't oval these, that could be a problem. They did decide to sort of elongate these holes in the cable tray, but didn't do it to the rest of the frame. And I think that's the only negative design to this frame. Everything else is great, but I am going to do that just in case it decides to move. And there's 2 ways I could do that. Option number 1 is to take a bigger drill bit and just re-drill these holes to have a little bit of wiggle room around the screw, but I don't have much metal to work with here, so the other option that I'm going to do is I'm going to take my Dremel tool and use a metal engraving bit and just insert it into the hole and kind of router back and forth to elongate these holes without necessarily widening them, because the slab will only expand and contract against the grain rather than with the grain. And so I only need them to be elongated sort of this way rather than this way. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and that should just be an extra security option in case that slab does decide to move. All that was left to do now was to mount the desk frame, and then it would be done. So without further ado, here is my finished live edge slab studio desk, and I am super happy with how it turned out. I'm definitely excited to start working here and continue building out my setup. So stay tuned for more videos because I plan to build some custom speaker stands and a monitor shelf for this desk. And I'll also do a full tour video of my setup after that when it's finished, because this will now be my main space for recording and editing my YouTube videos, music, and other things. And I hope to take this channel in the direction of helping and inspiring creators, whether that's sharing tips for growing on YouTube, or video and music editing tutorials and other creativity. So if any of that sounds interesting, then do be sure to subscribe. And with that, I will see you in the next one. Cheers.